Alright, I came across something tonight that I'd like to talk with y'all about. And it is a quote from an interview with Brian Robbins, the CEO of Paramount Studios. And that is, quote, "We're not going to release an expensive original animated movie and just pray people will come," end quote. So basically, what he's saying here is they're not going to come up with any new properties, and they're just going to go with old stuff. So they're going to pull things out of the old bucket, like SpongeBob or Avatar, and they're just going to make stuff that people liked in the past, and they'll remake them and they'll put it out for today. Now, before I get into the next part, I want to stress that doing work on an old IP is not a bad idea. If you take Avatar The Last Airbender, technically speaking, its sequel, The Legend of Korra, is an example of this where they took an old IP, they made a new project for it, and it was more or less successful. I think more than less, actually, if I remember correctly. But to kill all future original content, 10 years from now, when you wonder what happened to Paramount, this is what happened. This is the death of Paramount. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's because you will run out of IP. For anyone who doesn't know, IP stands for intellectual property. So usually this means in regards to like a particular franchise. So like if you had Star Wars, that's one IP. SpongeBob's an IP. Avatar's an IP. And basically he's saying we're only going to make stuff in franchises that already exist. Now, as anyone listening to this can probably imagine, that means you will never get the next John Wick. Because think about it. John Wick was a book IP. It was not a movie IP. So the first John Wick was original content as far as the movie-going experience is concerned. So you would never get the next John Wick. And John Wick came out at the height of superhero movies, where everything's all hunky-dory. No matter what happens, there's not a whole... Like, the violence is all fairly cartoonish. Most people are gonna live. You had Infinity War, but that all got undone in Endgame. And then you end up in John Wick, and it's just hyper-violent, extremely gritty, bloody, extremely noisy. There's just death and destruction everywhere. And it was a massive hit immediately. And you will never have that in the future from Paramount. And that will kill them. See, I'm from the Star Wars fan base. And while I look at Star Wars and I recognize just how much potential it has, I can also recognize that most people want to write roughly 3 or 4 stories. Actually, it's probably more like 6, because you have about 3 or 4 for each genre. You've got the Jedi stories, the good versus bad for the original trilogy, and then you've got a bunch of politics for the prequels, and then nobody knows what the sequels is doing. But you end up with politics and war stories in the prequels, and you end up with good versus bad in the original, and that's what most people want to write, even though there is vastly more room for it. Now, that's not to say that most franchises couldn't develop this way, but most franchises don't develop this way. And that's because, like, if you take Star Trek, certain people like watching Star Trek, and as a result, certain people want to write for Star Trek, and that's all the Star Trek fans. So you end up with writers who have kind of blinders on, and they're writing stories in one way because that's the story they want to write for that particular universe. And Brian Robbins, by choosing to only work on IP, just blinded his entire creative team. And in the entertainment industry, you have to do the opposite. You are constantly trying to remove their blinders. You are constantly trying to make sure that they're not stuck in a rut doing the same thing 500 times, because that's how you get people to watch your movies. That's how you get people to watch your shows, to buy your product, to go and get things off the shelf in a store for toys. You can't do it with blinders. I mean, sure, you can do it for a little bit, but long term, this is going to kill Paramount. So, what can be done to reverse this? What can be done to mitigate this problem? Well, frankly, you have to have good writers. That's about the only thing you can do. And that's part of what I'm trying to do here. My goal is eventually to replace Kathleen Kennedy as the CEO of Star Wars, but until then, I'm trying to help writers. I understand that I can't be a proper writer, but I'm hoping that I can provide enough valuable information that I can help them see the world bigger than what they have been taught and in different ways than what they've been originally taught so that they can write better stories so that we have better stories. Because movies aren't going to just die out. As much as people may think that the market for movies will go away, it isn't. That market only goes away when the movies are not up to the market. There is a level of quality they need to exist. And without it, they'll die no matter what happens around them. But with it, they will succeed regardless of how much YouTube gets in the way. You see, people like good stories, and some stories just take time to tell. So, this really saddens me to see just. I don't want movies to go down the drain. I don't want them to be a thing of the past. I want them to be better so that we still have them. So that 10, 20, 30 years from now, new stories are being told. I think it would be a tragedy to lose all of that. And I hope that other companies do not take the same lesson that Mr. Robbins is currently taking. Because that would just be a tragedy. Y'all have a good night.